Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Audrey Rindlisbacher. This is the podcast where we explore how the truth can make us free by learning about the natural law, the law of human nature, the moral law, first principles, and principles, how we can apply them and understand them and live according to them so that they can liberate us. Thank you for liking and subscribing and reviewing and sharing it out so that we can get the message out to more people and they can be liberated through truth as well. When we were raising our kids, I was trying to teach them the best that I could, and I was trying to help them build a relationship with God. And I was learning as I went, learning along with them. But one of the things I always kind of had a thing about the Ten Commandments. I've said to myself many times, I feel like if God had to whittle down the 10 most important things, that's kind of what we get in the Ten Commandments. What does he consider the 10 most important things that we should do or not do to have the best lives possible? And one of those 10 things is to keep the Sabbath day holy. And, this used to be very strict. In early America, you were required, in fact, we were just back in Williamsburg, and if you didn't attend church a certain number of times in the month, then you had to pay a fee. And, obviously nothing was open on Sunday. Even when I was a kid 50 years ago, lots of places were just not open on Sunday. It was just harder to get things on Sunday. And people were, there's been varying levels of laws and societal expectations around Sabbath, which different religions have a different holy day, but it's almost always at least one day in the week. And there are certain expectations of how you're going to keep this holy day, this Sabbath day. And so my husband and I were really conscientious about this, and we were, I guess, pretty strict. I mean, if you go back and read, I didn't pull it for you, but if you go back and read the Little House books, it's pretty crazy. Or like, oh, what was the other one I was thinking of? Little Britches or whatever. Like, those kids couldn't do anything on Sunday. I think it seems like in the Little House, there's a story of them sneaking out and going sledding and they get caught on Sunday. And, the Lord tells us to rest. And I was thinking about this because this last Sunday, everyone came home from church and started napping. And my husband was like literally all sprawled out, all his body parts on the couch and on the ottoman. And I took a picture and sent it to our family chat. Said, "This is the day of rest." My kids have grown up and they're making their own decisions about what Sunday means and what Sabbath is and how to worship and what kind of relationship they want to have with God and all that kind of stuff. And that's totally fine. That's totally up to them. There's a lot of, like I teach all the time, there's a lot of applications, but there's only a few principles. And in this case, this would seem to be a very important principle to God. Now we know that the first principles and principles he teaches us are for us, not for him. It doesn't make any difference to him if we keep the Sabbath day holy. Like, it's not like he's up there waiting, "Oh, here it comes. It's my day. I'm going to get, more attention." He doesn't care. It doesn't affect him at all. That commandment, which is just simply a first principle, because we know as we look around the world that every culture has had sacred spaces and sacred days and sacred events where there was certain behavior that was expected. And these are all to nurture the spirit, right? This is all to nurture the soul and to draw us closer to God. And so he obviously knows how badly we need a reset every week. And we need a time to commune with him and with other people. We need a time to reconnect. And I just want to share a few resources today, a few thoughts that I've been having around what it means to make it holy, what it means to rest, why it is that this would be one of God's top 10. Because I feel like, as far as just the secular world goes, a lot of people like it because it's usually one of their days off. There are still a lot of places that are closed on Sunday, not nearly as many as there used to be. But, I mean, for church going people, for religious people, it's just become more and more and more lax. And it's just another day to kind of rest and relax. So I'm going to take you through a few sources for the next few minutes and give you some things to think about that I think are really beautiful ways to think about not just Sabbath, not just Sunday, but connection with God and with ourselves and with others, and what makes that connection happen, and how some of the reasons why God might have made such a big deal about this one day a week, and maybe some of the things that he would love to see happen. So Mortimer Adler thought a lot about this because he talked all his life about the different categories of human activity. So he would talk about how there was work, and the work was what we needed to do, didn't necessarily want to do, that helped sustain us. The play was how we engaged in recreation to have fun. The leisure time were those activities that were good in and of themselves, that were rejuvenating, that essentially built our virtue, that were good for us and good for others. And he separates rest as a different kind of activity. He does it in multiple articles. And he explains that it's not the same as any of those activities. It's not work, and it's not play and recreation, and it's not a leisure activity either. As Aristotle says, one plays for the sake of work and works for the sake of leisure. So we want to have time off. And one of the things that we're doing in today's world is a lot of play with our time off instead of leisure activities. Leisure activities are those things that are really forward looking, that it's the development of our talents, it's the service of our community, it's being a good citizen. It's those things that are needed to make a good human life, a good a good family. Recreation and play are very rejuvenating, but they don't create connection in the same way that other things do. They do create connection, but other things create connection too. Different types of connection. Play creates a certain kind of connection, right? Work creates a certain kind of connection. Leisure activities like being involved in a cause can create a higher level of connection when you're really, trying to get a really good person elected to office, or you're trying to champion some need in the community, or you're feeding the hungry. Like, that's a different kind of connection. And he says that rest is a completely different kind of activity, and it also creates a different kind of connection. So he says this: to understand the meaning of the last activity, rest, one must refer to Genesis. On the seventh day, Genesis says, God rested. You know that God did not sleep, work, play, leisure, or idle on the seventh day. So he wasn't up there just playing a harp or going to an amusement park or, grinding it out at a job. What did God do? And this is where I really want to get at something about holiness and connection and Sabbath that we just don't do enough of. And I think it will help you think differently. What did God do when he rested? He looked at the world and said it was good, very good. He admired it. Rest, to put it another way, is contemplation. The third commandment is to keep the Sabbath day holy as a day of rest. In Orthodox Judaism, not an ounce of work is done on the Sabbath. You can't even light the stove. You can't cut a piece of bread. You must do nothing. If these things have to be done, they have to be done by a Gentile, not a Jew. The only thing you can do on the Sabbath is pray. The day is spent in prayer, which is a form of rest, and most of us have very little of it in our lives. So prayer isn't the only restful activity. He talks earlier in a different article about it a little bit differently. He says, in terms of this conception of rest, I want to distinguish even between contemplation and thinking. Thinking is a leisure activity because you're trying to solve problems. When he talks about thinking, he talks about, something like that James Madison did, and thinking about how can I keep our country free, or something that's trying to someone that's trying to solve a complex math problem, or a business problem. That's thinking, and that's a really valuable, important thing to do. But contemplation is different. He says, contemplation is an activity of rest. Accordingly, if rest exists at all in this earthly life, it exists, I think, in religious activity, only in prayer and worship, and in the contemplation practiced by religious orders. And from this point of view, everything is either work or rest, because all of these other things he's saying, he's putting in this broad category of work. So if we're to rest, and that means contemplation, and that means some religious activities, it doesn't have to be exclusively prayer and worship, although those are contemplative activities. I've read recently, my son is in a liberal arts high school and a classical liberal school, and he comes home with great stuff all the time. And he handed me this article the other day called Reverence by Dietrich von Hildebrand. And it's beautiful. It's incredible. I'll try to link it if I can find it online for you. He starts out by talking about, and I've talked about this in other podcasts, if you know, and this goes all the way back to the ancient Greek philosophers, if you know what something is for, then you know how to make it excellent. If you know that a chair might look nice hanging on a wall and might be useful to set books on, but it really is meant to be sat on, then you're going to make it differently, because you're going to build it so that it's comfortable to the human body, because that is what it's for. And it will be most excellent to the extent that it gives rest and relaxation to the person that's sitting in it. They can sit in it for a long period of time and be comfortable. And to the extent that a chair does that, it is excellent. And so human beings, the ancients said, and I mean, everybody said this until probably the last 100 years, that human beings exist to use their reason to excel and to become excellent. And the way they become excellent is in the virtues. They become virtuous. So what we're trying to do is become more of who we are. We're trying to become as excellent as we can be. And that requires that discipline. So he starts out by saying, okay, so we want to value the right things, and true values, the virtues, are things that are good in and of themselves. He says, goodness, purity, truthfulness, and humility rank higher than genius, brilliance, energetic vitality, and the beauty of nature or art, or any power or anything like that. It's actually being good, true, pure, that is the highest end of human beings. So if that's the case, then how is it that we become the best that we can be? How is it that we grow in virtue? And he said there's one cardinal, he calls it a value, but it's also a virtue, and that virtue is reverence. He says, only when one understands that there exist things with their own value can you turn your duty toward them and let yourself be formed by their law. Only the man who can see beyond his subjective horizon and is free from pride doesn't always ask what is satisfying me can come to possess the moral virtues. So it requires that we put aside our pride. And he talks about these different kinds of pride. And it's so fascinating because he gets to the point where he gives us a really solid definition of reverence. And it's so beautiful. It's so different than I've ever thought about reverence before. And I think it really corresponds with this concept of rest and contemplation that Adler is talking about. He says, when someone is proud, he is a prisoner of himself. He's blind to things that are higher than him. He says he's forceful and he's tactless. He or she always thinks they're right, and they want things to be the way they think they ought to be. And and I've talked about this in other podcasts, I'm this way a lot. And one of the things I've realized is, I was looking up something else recently, and it talked about, I think it was in Lewis, and he talked about how pride is competitive in nature. And I realized that my tendency to compare is me being competitive. And even when I come out on the bottom, which I do a lot, I compare myself to someone, then I think, oh, they're so much better than me in this thing, then it's my pride. And I'm not going to grow at all mentally, spiritually, emotionally when I'm caught up in that place. And so he's saying, being proud is the enemy of being truly reverent, because you're forcing your way on things. You think it ought to look a certain way. And we even do this even when we have good intentions. Like we think our child should really go to college, or we're really mad because we didn't get this certain job, or we're upset because our spouse is doing something wrong and hurting us. And we try to force our way on it. We want it to turn out the way we want it to turn out. We're mad that things are going the way that they're going. And so this is our pride. He says this person listens only to themselves and ignores the rest of being. It's the person for whom nothing could be greater than themselves. And I think sometimes we think that we are not proud, and we think that we don't have this problem because we acknowledge, oh yeah, there's a God. Oh yeah, there's natural laws, there's principles, whatever. But actually, actually, we're just trying to make up a new script. It might be based on better principles, but it's still us forcing our way onto things. It's still us dictating how it's supposed to turn out. What then do we do instead? How do we truly rest? How do we truly contemplate? Prayer is a good way, but prayer can take so many forms. Prayer is a form of communication and communion, but it doesn't have to be talking. And it doesn't even always have to be listening. So if we're talking about spending the Sabbath doing religious activities, doing restful, contemplative things, doing reverent things, then what does that actually mean? He says, just to be really clear about this proud person, they are not open to the spiritual self. They are in a perpetual cage of the ego. Thought that was so beautiful. He says that reverence is the indispensable presupposition to all deep knowledge. And we tend to think of reverence as being quiet. And if it's not really digging in, doing hard mental work, trying to solve difficult problems, then what is it? So he says, reverence is the attitude which can be designated as the mother of all moral life, for in it you first take a position toward the world which opens your spiritual eyes and gives you a grasp on the highest values and excellences. He says it is a responsive attitude to the value of being. It's filled by the readiness to recognize something superior to your own will and pleasure, and ready to submit and surrender yourself to it. It allows the spiritual eye to see the deeper nature of every being. It leaves to being the possibility of revealing its essence. And if you go back and listen to my podcast, where I talked about Plato's and Aristotle's forms and what it is to have substance and reaching for that higher being, that form being the essence. If you see that ancient idea here, that form is the essence of who you are, and it's perfect, and it comes from God, and it's in you, and it's in all of nature and all of the world. It makes you capable of grasping the higher things. To this person will the sublime beauty of a sunset or a ninth symphony of Beethoven reveal itself to him. But to him who approaches it reverently and unlocks his heart to it, to that person, the mystery which is present in life and manifests itself in every plant will reveal its true splendor. He talks about this idea of surrendering to something important. You give yourself to the good and the beautiful. Each time you conform to the inner law of value. And I talked about that in that podcast too, of conforming to that inner law of seeing the essence of the thing. And so he's building on that. So if you have an understanding of how that form works, and that everything has this essence, this form, this ideal, and if you're reverent, he talks about space all the time. You leave space so that the thing can unfold itself fully and in its proper mode. It's like this way of being that's not just quiet. You're sitting there taking it in. You're giving it space. You're letting it be. You're closing your mouth. You're not giving orders. You're letting people or things grow at their own pace. He says, to give situations, things, and persons a chance to unfold themselves in their proper character and value. So it's such a beautiful idea because it's the opposite of forceful. You're not making judgments and making decisions and coming to conclusions and comparing and being critical and being competitive. You're standing back. You're giving space. He talks about that a lot, giving space, letting the thing unfold, being patient with the process, and coming to know the true essence of what the thing is. It reminds me a lot of, I did a podcast on, she's the author, Jean Stratton Porter. I did a mission-driven story on Jean Stratton Porter. Go listen to that one because it really reminds me of all of her like nature studies and the way she went about them. She just was taking it in. She was reverent in this way, truly reverent, letting nature and things unfold naturally and show them, reveal themselves to her and come to their true essence and fruition, and giving them the space to be what they are going to be and observing them as they really were. We don't do this with people. I know as a mom, I am constantly wanting to force my time frame, my attitudes, societal norms on my children and want them to conform. And it has so much to do with pride because I want to look good, because I want to be able to brag on them, because when I talk about them, I want people to understand and think that I'm a good mom. You know, I was talking to somebody at a church event last night and she was talking about my son, and he is an amazing person. And she was like, you know, he's such an amazing person and he does all these things right. And I was like, look, it is all on his own merit. He has made those good choices. He has done those good things. He is who he is because of the choices that he made. He says, this is so beautiful. Reverence is the indispensable presupposition for all deep knowledge. So if we're setting aside time, if we're setting aside a day, we're trying to come to deeper knowledge. That's what we're doing. And that deeper knowledge is higher than us. It's supernatural. It's metaphysical. Because we're engaged in the world all week. We have 6 days to be involved in all the things that go on in the world. And this 7th day, this time, this day of rest, this day of reverence, this time of stepping back is space. It's slowing down. It's taking time. It's letting things unfold. It's an attitude you can have toward that day, but it's also an attitude you can have toward life. And he goes into that. He goes into how you can have that way of being towards other people. He says, all capacity to be made happy and uplifted by values, all surrendering to values, all submission to their majesty requires reverence. In reverence, the person takes into account the noble beauty of the world of values. It is to be found in it is to be found that upward look toward the world, that respect for the valid demands of the values which call for an adequate response. So we're evaluating ourselves, and are we living in virtue? Are there things that we need to repair in ourselves and others? You know, I kept thinking about science, and there's so much, you know, noble research and good things that happen in science, but science is largely, you know, picking apart and dissecting and looking inside and exploring. And there's nothing wrong with that. But he's talking about taking the world in a different way, and especially people. And that's kind of where I want to end with this, because after he's talked about, you know, you're standing back, you're having a reverent attitude, he says, the virtue of reverence is the basis for all moral action toward our fellow men and toward ourselves. If we don't take ourselves and others seriously to some degree, if we don't stand back and let ourselves and others have space, if we don't forgive and be patient and make room for growth, we're being proud and we're being forceful and we're being irreverent. We're making a mockery of God's plan for things. We're getting in his way. We're saying that we know better than how events are unfolding. That doesn't mean that we don't set goals or that we don't move forward in our lives, that we don't take action. Of course, we're intentional, but there needs to be time and space in our lives. That's why God has given us a day. But you need to take the time regularly to be reverent with yourself, reverent with others, reverent with the world, and standing back and taking space. Only to the man possessing reverence is revealed the full grandeur and depth of the values which belong to every man as a spiritual person. The spiritual person is a conscious, free being, and as a being who is capable of knowing and grasping the rest of being and of taking a meaningful position toward it, can only be recognized by a reverent mind. Only when you stop judging and you stop trying to control things, can you actually truly assess where true growth is happening and look honestly at what you can acknowledge, what you can confirm, what you can be grateful for, what you can congratulate for in another person, even in yourself. If you're always running and judging and shaming and blaming, there's never time to be reverent. It says, a being who is able and destined to accomplish in himself a rich world of values, to become a vessel of goodness, purity, and humility. This is a person. I loved that so much. I was like, that's true, because that's when you have separated yourself from animals. That's when you have become fully human. When you have taken yourself and others and the world and God reverently, and you have taken the time to let them unfold naturally, and you stop in trying to impose your will on everything else, and you let God's will be done, and you are in a submissive state, and you are ready to grasp the beauty and the goodness that's all around you, and to let the essence, again, go back to that podcast on essence and forms, and let that unfold. Now, here's the pinnacle of what I want to say to you. It's so beautiful because it corresponds with love, which we talk all about in the academies incessantly, because when we were building it, we just kept coming back to, and it all has to do with love. But love in the truest form, true love according to a correct understanding of what love is. The basic attitude of reverence is what is needed for every true love, because it alone opens our eyes to the value of everyone as a spiritual person. Reverence for the one who was loved is also essential to every element of love, since giving attention to the specific meaning and value of their individuality, displaying consideration toward them instead of forcing our wishes on him or her. It is the spiritual. Okay, I'm just going to read another. It's so beautiful. It is from reverence that there flows the willingness of the one who loves. We talk so much. I'm telling you, this theme of willful and willingness, we have a whole lecture on it in the academy, and I see it. It shows up all the time. The willingness of one who loves to grant the loved one the spiritual space needed to freely express their own individuality. All these elements of every true love flow from reverence. Now, does this mean that we stand by idly and watch while someone displays self-destruction? No, it's not as what he's saying at all. But in line with the true order of things, in line with what's the best in them, excellence in them. He goes on to talk about, you have to limit your own desire for power. And reverence for our neighbors is the basis of all true community life, for the right approach to marriage, the family, the nation, the state, humanity, for respect of legitimate authority, the fulfillment of moral duties toward the community as a whole and toward the individual members of that community. And this takes me to the last thing I want to talk about, in conjunction with this and the love that we hold for each other. I could go into a lot. I'm going to talk about love in an upcoming podcast because we really need to dig deep into that. But this is Weight of Glory. I have another podcast. I think it's on communion where I talk about the weight of glory. I'm going to quote again what I talk about there, and that is at the end of this article by C.S. Lewis on the weight of glory. He talks again about, he says, it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It's hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. Sometimes we're so busy doing, I think that, sometimes we can spend our time better in contemplation, reverence, thinking, not in the Adlerian sense, but pondering the world, pondering others, evaluating, really trying to let their true essence unfold, looking for the good. Instead of saying, who can I take another casserole to, which is not a bad thing to say. It's a very good thing to say. But sometimes the better thing to say is, how can I learn more about this person? How can I let who they are unfold in my life? How can I make space for them to open up to me so that I can know them better and better help them? I have a friend who has a lot of back pain and she's stuck at home all the time. And I've learned a lot about gratitude, and it's made a huge difference in my life. And I, write gratitude regularly, and I've had gratitude journals and such. And not that I thought that she was ungrateful, but as an Easter gift, I decided to give her a gratitude journal. And I just gave her a card, and I just said, I just want you to have this Easter because I feel so grateful for so many things. And in times in my life when I've been going through a lot of difficulty, writing gratitude every day has been a huge blessing. And because I had taken the time to listen to this woman, to make space, to not judge her and be like, well, you should do this more, and you should be at church more, and you should this, that, and the other thing, which I still do to people regularly, but thank goodness, I let the essence of who she is unfold more in my life. I could respond to it in a way that was truly helpful for her. And instead of running around, doing something that everybody else does, taking her, cookies or whatever, because it was a holiday, in this case, I gave her something that was truly heartfelt, not even expensive, but just from my heart. And I got a text from her recently where she said that ever since I gave her that note and gratitude journal, she's written gratitude almost every day. And it is making a difference in her being able to see how much better her life is than she thought. And in the midst of all her back pain, be more grateful, be happier, be more at peace. And so when we are reverent, we can do the same thing with ourselves. Where are we truly being too hard on ourselves? Where do we need to extend some grace to ourselves? Where do we need to be more patient as we unfold? Where could we understand ourselves better and be more patient and be more forgiving of ourselves and our own progress toward fulfilling our potential? He says, this burden, this load, this weight of my neighbor's glory should be weighed on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. And so, if pride is the opposite of so many good virtues, it is the great sin, the great vice, because it keeps us from humbly submitting to virtues that will bring us increased joy and personal fulfillment. And reverence is definitely a very critical starting point to looking at ourselves and at the world more fully. There's so much we don't see. There's so much we don't capture about the people in our lives, about ourselves, about the nature of our God, about the beautiful world we live in, beautiful systems and leaders and programs and just beautiful things that have been built and created by so many people around us. And it increases our ability to love. When we recognize that we live among potential gods and goddesses, which is what C.S. Lewis finishes off with, It's very humbling to live with potential gods and goddesses, he says. And we stop being so arrogant. We stop thinking we have it all figured out. We stop assuming that we know best and we know what everybody else ought to do. And we recognize that we can stop and rest. We can be reverent. We can, and it will start us on a journey of being able to live other virtues better, to be more generous, more kind, more grateful, more forgiving, more loving. All of those things will be an extension, because you can't truly have understanding until you have reverence. And you can't have reverence until you've first taken things seriously and recognized that they are glorious creations of God. And it's humbling and ennobling to think of yourself and the ones that you love and the world around you in reverent ways. Thanks for joining me today. Pass this along if you think it will be helpful to anyone you know or love. Please go ahead and subscribe and leave a review. That's greatly appreciated, and I will see you next time.